Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. The first 100 days of any new presidential administration offers a key inflection point, signaling the policies that the new administration will prioritize and champion. It is during those first 100 days that the new administration gets the most leeway from Congress, the media, and the general public to set their agenda. Setting that agenda often includes a mix of new executive actions, supporting specific pieces of legislation, and releasing a federal budget request to Congress, which demonstrates the new administration's funding priorities. This is the opportunity for the Biden administration when it takes office on January 20th. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into what a Biden administration's first 100-day agenda may look like when it comes to resetting America's relationship with the United Nations and other multilateral organizations. Peter Yo is the president of the Better World Campaign and senior vice president of the United Nations Foundation. He has had a long career in Congress, the federal government, and advocacy, and he explains the various executive actions and legislative priorities that the Biden administration will likely pursue to signal the United States' renewed commitment to multilateralism. Today's episode is produced in partnership with the Better World Campaign as part of a series examining the opportunities for strengthening multilateral engagement by the new Biden-Harris administration and the incoming 117th Congress. To learn more and access additional episodes in this series, please visit getusback.org, and I'll post a link in the show notes of the episode. All right, now here is my conversation with Peter Yo, president of the Better World Campaign and senior vice president of the United Nations Foundation.
When the president issues an executive order, it really gives him the ability to get stuff done without congressional approval. There are parameters around what can be in an executive order and what's a bridge too far in terms of an executive order. But the concept behind an executive order is steps that can be taken unilaterally by the President of the United States related to, among other things, America's role in the world that really can have an impact and can have, in many cases, an immediate impact.
Presumably, the Biden transition team is preparing a number of executive orders that Biden could sign on day one. And we know from media reports what some of them might be, like, say, returning to the Paris Climate Accords. What do you expect to see from Biden on day one?
Well, as we think about the day one agenda in terms of America's relationship with the UN or multilaterally more generally, there's a bunch of items. Number one is withdrawing the letter that was presented by the Trump administration to the Secretary General that withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization. So if President Biden on day one withdraws this letter, then the U.S. will once again be will continue to be a full member of the World Health Organization.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but that letter said something like, on X day after this letter, we will withdraw from the WHO.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the United States needed to give a 1-year notice to the World Health Organization that it was withdrawing, and we're still within that 1-year window. So if President Biden on day one basically revokes that letter, then the U.S. membership in WHO remains intact. And now there's an agenda that needs to happen there in terms of paying our dues to WHO and participating in COVAX, which is the sort of WHO-led initiative to support the deployment of a COVID vaccine to countries around the world in partnership with the developed world. But in any event, I mean, that's a day one action, is basically say to the WHO, don't worry, we're not withdrawing, we're still a member. And that's a day one action. I think another day one action is Paris Climate Accord. We will have missed the deadline, unfortunately, to withdraw, to sort of stop the clock on Paris. But the U.S. can signal that it is rejoining Paris. And the announcement that former Secretary of State, former Senator John Kerry, will be leading our global efforts on climate changes. Boy, what a welcome development that is. And so as we think about rejoining Paris, as we think about going to Glasgow, which is the next meeting of the conference of parties to figure out next steps on Paris implementation, John Kerry's going to be there, and the U.S. will be at the table. And so that's an exciting element. We're already seeing this. I mean, we didn't need to wait to day one because John Kerry's appointment has already been announced. So we have WHO, we have Paris, and we have the UN Population Fund. That's a day one action that needs to occur.
Will you explain what that is? Because that is restoring U.S. funding to the UN Population Fund is probably a less known on day one item than World Health Organization, reentry, and Paris Climate Accord. Can you just explain a little bit of the background there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this has been unfortunately, a political football between Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States, which Democratic administrations fund our contributions to the UN Population Fund, and Republicans generally remove all funding from the Population Fund, largely on specious and erroneous arguments about UNFPA's role in China, particularly China's previous one-child policy, which it no longer has and does not implement. But in any event, as we think about the day one, the UNFPA does amazing work around the world. I've seen it, visited important UNFPA projects in Jordan. So, UNFPA does family planning, does the full range of, sexual and reproductive health services, although it does not perform abortions, fund abortions, which is what the Republicans say, but it's incorrect. And it does amazing work in terms of empowering women and girls around the world. So anyways, it's exciting to see that on day one, the Biden administration will be refunding the UN Population Fund.
So those are three specific executive actions that we can expect on the very first day of the Biden administration. And they've signaled as much already. Looking forward, the first 100 days is always a key inflection point for a new administration. I want to ask you sort of two baskets of questions. The first is, what more further executive actions would you expect the administration to take in that first 100 days in terms of resetting or re-engaging U.S. approach to the UN and other other aspects of multilateral cooperation? And then what actions require U.S. Congress and cooperation between the administration and Congress? So first on that executive action basket of questions, what would you expect in the first 100 days to be accomplished?
Yeah, a couple things, which is, first of all, the U.S. is currently not a member of the UN Human Rights Council. We withdrew our membership during the Trump administration. And so 2021, in the first 100 days, will be an important moment for the U.S. to signal that it wishes to run for the Human Rights Council again. The elections will be held at the end of 2021 for a 3-year term beginning in January of 2022. But there's a lot of work that's going to need to get done in that first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration to prepare for a U.S. run for the Human Rights Council.
Because I should say this could potentially be a competitive election in which the U.S. would run against other countries in Western Europe.
It should be. It should be a competitive election.
Mm-hmm.
Best practice is that countries should have to make the case for why they should be a member of the Human Rights Council, and so the U.S. needs to run. We need to make the case as to why we believe that we will be a responsible member of the Human Rights Council. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to get done on that front. As you said, it's a competitive election. I think the other element is we need to figure out how much the U.S. owes the UN and in what buckets. There's sort of a forensic accounting that needs to happen in the first 100 days because we think that the U.S. owes at least $1 billion in overdue bills to the United Nations. And frankly, as we think about the first 100 days, we need to work closely with our partners at the UN, and the State Department needs to work with them to figure out, what do we owe for the peacekeeping? What do we owe for the UN regular budget? What do we owe to other UN funds, programs, and agencies? And then include all of that in the president's budget request. And that's where Congress comes in, because Congress, of course, needs to appropriate the money to pay our overdue bills, to pay our ongoing bills. So that's an area of partnership.
Can I stop you there and probe a bit deeper? Because I know you follow this issue very closely. What do you suspect are the big outstanding bills that the United States owes to the UN right now? And how is the fact that the UN is owed so much money impacting UN operations, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, we know that we owe at least $1 billion for peacekeeping because we have been, for the past 4 years, we have been paying roughly 25% of the peacekeeping bills that the UN incurs, but we're supposed to be paying at the moment 27.8, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up to roughly $250 million each year in unpaid bills. Just as an important reminder, there's not a peacekeeping mission that is created, changed, or ended without explicit U.S. approval because of our veto on the Security Council. So the U.S. is voting for all these peacekeeping missions. We're just not paying the bills. And that's having an impact. It's delaying all of the countries that contribute the troops to peacekeeping. They're getting paid incredibly late. A lot of the UN contractors that contribute to, the planes, the fuel for the planes, that type of stuff, they're being paid late. So it's encouraging the worst budget practices as a result of us paying late.
I've seen like an increasingly dire tone from statements from Antonio Guterres about their cash flow and liquidity crisis. Every couple months, it seems I see like a new press release or a new statement about how cash strapped and cash poor the UN is at the moment because of many of these outstanding bills.
Yeah, and it's not just in that case, it's not just UN peacekeeping; it's the UN regular budget. The fact is, the U.S. owes money for the UN regular budget. And the regular budget, of course, supports what's happening in New York and supports the broader range of UN operations on the peace and security front. And so, it's a real challenge that the U.S. owes money to the UN regular budget and is paying what it is paying is coming very late, and it's causing severe liquidity issues.
So I'm glad we're getting a little bit into the weeds here of how the U.S. funds the UN because, it turns out that the guiding legislation for U.S. funding for the UN contains the name of the president-elect of the United States, the Helms-Biden law, which was passed, in like the late 90s?
Indeed.
So can you explain what that law is? Because it is now, of course, seemingly very relevant.
Yeah. So one of my jobs at the State Department was to serve on the State Department negotiating team that negotiated the Helms-Biden package in the late 1990s, in which now the president-elect, then Senator Biden, played an essential role. And basically, it linked $1 billion in overdue bills to the UN. It's amazing how we tend to operate in $1 billion increments, to a series of 40 plus reforms, most of which have been implemented. But as part of the Helms-Biden package, it contained a cap, a 25% cap on the U.S. share for peacekeeping. Now, Congress has frequently waived that cap, but for the last 4 years it hasn't, and that's what's caused the arrears. So we need a real discussion with Congress on the importance of the U.S. paying its dues in full. But the core essence of Helms-Biden was about reform and change, and that needs to be part of the, and I'm certain will be part of the Biden-Harris approach towards our engagement with the UN and the UN system. You know, as we think about development reforms, management reforms, peace and security reforms, all of which are part of the Secretary General's reform agenda, the U.S. really needs to play a role in supporting reform and really working to develop coalitions of like-minded countries that are committed to change, are committed to cost effectiveness, and are really committed to performance measurement to make sure that the investments that we're all making in the UN system actually, it's money well spent, and it's actually having the impact that we want in terms of our partnership with countries around the world. That was at the heart of Helms-Biden, and will remain at the heart, I imagine, of our approach to the UN today.
I mean, do you see the prospect of a new kind of guiding legislation a la Helms-Biden to guide U.S. Relationship with the United Nations in the coming years?
I don't think it's needed. I think what's needed is we need to pay our dues to the United Nations, both current bills and existing bills. But the U.S. already has a seat at the table in any discussion about management and reforms, any change in the way that the UN does business. And so if we pay our dues in full and pay our arrears, our ability to actually work with other countries toward change will increase. If we actually link it to money that we already owe, reduces our credibility. And so I feel like if we pay our dues, we already have a seat at the table.
So we're speaking at a time where we know that Biden will be president, that the Democrats will control the House of Representatives, though the Senate control of the Senate is somewhat up in the air. We're awaiting these two runoff elections in Georgia in early January. Does the congressional agenda you just outlined hinge on one way or another on the outcome of those elections in January?
Well, I think that the outcome of the Georgia elections would certainly make it easier to get full funding for the UN moving forward. But it's not essential, right? In the sense that any type of appropriations bill that Congress works on is a negotiation. And so Lindsey Graham, who is the current chairman and will continue to be the chairman of the State Foreign Ops Subcommittee, has been often a very positive partner on all things UN and has a very open door on these issues. So while the outcome of the Georgia races will have an impact, I wouldn't say it's a sole determinative factor. I think the other element to consider here is that we have a top-notch ambassador designate for the UN in Linda Thomas Greenfield. And her ability, she's well-known on Capitol Hill. She's very popular on Capitol Hill in Republican and Democratic offices. And she's going to have a real ability to deliver, to have substantive conversations about the full range of issues in the U.S.-UN relationship, including funding. And so that's the Biden-Harris administration, frankly, is already starting ahead with such a thoughtful and strategic choice in terms of our ambassador to the UN.
And what about the choice of Anthony Blinken, as Secretary of State? What does that suggest to you about Biden's approach to multilateral engagement and what that first 100-day agenda might look like?
Well, of course, Secretary-designate Tony Blinken has been Biden's chief foreign policy guy for many, many years. I worked with him when I worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he was staff director in the Foreign Relations Committee. And I think what it signals is a commitment to multilateralism. Tony understands the power of the UN. He was Deputy Secretary of State and worked extensively with the UN on a wide variety of issues, including refugees and refugee policy. And it doesn't mean that it's, multilateralism is the only way to get stuff just done. It means that multilateralism will once again be a core element of the U.S. diplomatic toolbox, along with our bilateral approaches to other countries, along with foreign assistance. But multilateralism is back, and Tony very much appreciates the role that not just the UN in New York plays, but that all of the UN agencies like the UN Refugee Agency, the Human Rights Council, UN Population Fund, Tony instinctively understands from his years of service to the president-elect why these investments we make, the U.S. makes, actually matter to American interests.
And I'm glad we spent a bit of time talking about Congress, because it's just, to me, interesting to note that someone who really cut their teeth in like the weeds and trenches of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a staffer is now the Secretary of State designate. I mean, that signals to me you'll have someone just who has kind of deep understanding of the legislative process and of all the processes that you just described that would help reset U.S. relationship with the United Nations.
Well, you can't two things. You can't reset America's relationship with the UN, and you can't rebuild the State Department and America's diplomatic platform without the active support of Congress. We need a partnership with Congress on all of this. And we have many strong supporters of both issues in Congress on the Republican and Democratic aisle. Tony Blinken and Linda Thomas Greenfield are uniquely positioned because of their close ties and experience on Capitol Hill to play an essential role in rebuilding this relationship and rebuilding these ties. And so these are wise move. And in Tony's case, it's certainly the case of a congressional staffer doing good. He's had a brilliant career since he left the Hill, serving with the vice president, then serving as Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2 position at the State Department. So the Biden-Harris administration is really lucky to get him.
Finally, are there any other action items or executive actions that you would expect or foresee the Biden administration to take on, either in the first 100 days or perhaps shortly thereafter?
I think that there's a lot of discussion about our re-engagement and refunding of UNRWA. As you know,
that's the UN humanitarian agency that supports Palestinian refugees.
Correct. And so under the Trump administration, all funding to UNRWA was ended. They are now experiencing a financial crisis as a result of this. So my guess is that will be a front burner issue to figure out how to re-engage with UNRWA. I think UNESCO is also out there as an issue for consideration. The U.S. under the Trump administration withdrew from UNESCO, which is UNESCO is the UN's educational and cultural and scientific organization. So I'm sure there will be an active debate, again, involving Congress as to whether the U.S. Should consider membership in UNESCO. Super complicated issue, will require congressional approval. But this will certainly be, I imagine, on the agenda for consideration.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, and as always, nice to speak to you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Peter Yo. That was very helpful. Peter is someone I've known for a very long time, and he's someone who I've always come to rely on to help me better understand the intricacies of the important relationship between the United States and the United Nations. Again, check out getusback.org to access other episodes in this series, which are forthcoming. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.